Čekamo znači ovu knjigu što je bila tu zabavljivo. Ali imamo vremena.
Ima vremena da prebacim prezentaciju?
Ajde, ja sam to.
Ne, pustimo.
Može.
Ili ako imate neki USB njega. Imate neki USB ili nešto?
I guess it's been a lot of
Antić, ti samo prešao prije par mjeseci ili? Koliko tamo?
6.
Da,
6 mjeseci.
I on.
Znači, nikad se što bliže u tim.
Žeš ovako? Ivana, može? Ok, odlično. Dear friends, we are very happy actually to have with us today Marko Savković. Dr. Marko Savković, he was a program coordinator at the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence, where he was also the executive director of the Regional Academy for Democracy. Only to mention, I was a fellow of this academy, only to mention, so we can continue now. Previously, Marco worked as a researcher in the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, specializing in the fields of defense reform, civil military relations, and Euro-Atlantic integration. He has a PhD from the University of Belgrade. In 2009, he co-authored the first dictionary of European security published in the languages of the region. His work and thoughts have been published extensively in academic journals, as well as various magazines and portals. Since a couple of months, Marko is working in a team of Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia. Today, Marko will speak about the challenge of a rapidly shrinking population to development and peace in the Western Balkans. Marko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Goran. I hope you can all hear me. Do I need a microphone?
It's a question about the people from Zoom.
Yes. It would be good if I had a microphone. Okay, I suppose so. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't look. Thank you, Goran, and really happy to be with you here today. As you have said, as of 6 months ago, I have been working with two colleagues within what is a newly established team for population issues attached to the Office of Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia. So our mandate is actually to act as a sort of liaison between UNDP in Serbia and the Prime Minister's office and to try and to slowly, I would say slowly but surely, create a kind of a policy response to this challenge of depopulation, which is, of course, nothing new, but being a multidimensional challenge and seeking expertise and knowledge from many different fields, walks of life. The team itself also reflects this, and we have a psychologist, an immigration expert, and someone who comes more on the side of, I would say, general politology and political science. Now, the numbers are alarming, and one thing when one dwells into the issue of depopulation is actually not to focus too much on numbers because it can blur the perspective a bit. It easily becomes, in a way, you get into this apocalyptic, dystopian kind of considerations. I mean, whatever projections you look at, this population decline is going to be sharp. And projections show decline from 6 to 11% for Montenegro, Kosovo, and North Macedonia to almost 20% for Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. Declines in rural populations that have been happening across several decades now will double or triple these overall forecasts. I'm mostly concerned with Serbia being part of the team working for the Prime Minister's office, of course, and we know today that we have as many citizens as we had in the 1960s, so 6 years ago, when our population peaked, and we are looking at a long-term prognosis that speaks of 4.7 million inhabitants and entire regions, of course, in South and Eastern Serbia, at risk of losing up to 40% of population. Now, really, some estimates are so concerning that it makes you very hard, almost hard to believe, versus saying that there is a region that will have no young people in 2100. It's hard even to imagine how would a region with no young people all look like. There are similar regions across the entire Western Balkans, and numbers are also similar. And what we have learned as a team, when you start advocating for certain policy action, is that these predictions are so dire that basically they lead you to a kind of an inaction. You feel powerless, and whatever I do, this is a trend that we cannot reverse. Now, again, not a new phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon for which financial institutions and social protection systems are not prepared. Rapidly declining birth rates, high urbanization, expansion of reproductive rights, slowing or negative population growth. So this is a significant change. It concerns lifestyle, it concerns aspirations, but on the other hand, it is a sort of a civilizational achievement as well, and there is definitely no going back. There are implications of this transition: shrinking labor force, skilled labor brain drain, higher dependency ratios, and financial pressure that should worry policymakers. It should worry them immediately because we are looking towards a perspective where some of these systems will become unsustainable. And altogether, they are a threat to our development prospect. This ability that we are, I would say, pretty obsessed with, which is to catch up with more developed societies. Now, some of the limiting factors that we also encountered. First, there's the quality of demographic data. So whoever you ask, they will say the data is a problem. It has to do a lot with the censuses that are overdue. Again, whichever country you take into consideration, they can either postpone the census for different issues, sometimes political, sometimes, for instance, in Serbia, we were scheduled to have our next census in the midst of highest corona crisis, so we postponed it for October, November, and the initial data should be ready by the end of the year. Then there's the nature of circular migration as a, again, newer phenomenon. Many suspect that populations are actually smaller than reported in official sources. People have left, or they are somewhere in between, but they don't really cancel their residence, and it's very hard to determine where they actually are. There are still unknown demographic ramifications of the Ukrainian conflict. This is, I would say, more specific conflict in the case of Serbia. Refugees from Ukraine are, of course, across Europe. Serbia is an outlier in a way that we can also, there is a number of Russian citizens who have come to Serbia to move their businesses in the aftermath of the beginning of the war. And numbers are still, in a way, sketchy, but we are looking only at businesses alone. We're talking about over 1,000 businesses that have moved for 3 months or so. And finally, I would say a kind of a food for thought in a way is this whole the position that perhaps there are some positive effects of the population. And when some talk about positive effects, they look at this relationship with the environment and how we might look at reduction of greenhouse gases, for instance. And I would say that the whole linkage between environment and depopulation is still something where a lot of additional research is to be designed. Now, again, the whole challenge of catching up. With the rapidly shrinking population, it's probably unattainable. One of the reasons why this is the case is, well, we are supposed to transition to a more productive economy, but this is not happening. I mean, our catching up, sorry, the presentation is, I totally lost it, right?
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, really sorry. Really sorry, I totally lost it. Okay. So please just go to the next slide. Yes, the one before. Thank you. Sorry. I don't have this habit of saying dalje. Sorry. So despite digitalization and automation, the lack of available professionals in all fields ultimately will threaten the state capacity to provide basic services. This is already happening throughout the region. First to suffer are impoverished regions, which are far from international corridors and changes for people with services, where many have already decided to leave. If we accept that decline in population is inevitable, then those who remain must be more productive, and precondition is significant increase in investment in human capital. It means education, public health, supporting infrastructure. So this is something that's, again, not really happening. Next slide. So one way to approach the issues have been pronatal policies. This is we can call it Hungarian model, but really it's something that many governments have tried to do. And they focus on increasing birth fertility rates in a way to restore population growth. But even the most all-encompassing, ambitious, expensive policy will not reverse it. It will only slow down this trend of shrinking. I mean, Hungary is such one example where 5% of GDP, 7.5 billion euros each year is allocated to family support. They have tried more or less everything: cash benefits, tax breaks, housing provisions. Of course, it all starts with ideology. This is another issue altogether. It should be discussed, but still. The state nationalized IVF clinics. It provided generous loans for couples with promise to procreate imminently. and lifetime income tax exemption for having 4 or more children. So it's really hard to think of what else can a state do in order to, persuade you to have more kids. Now the thing is, actually, it could, increase the quality of life. That is a long-term thing. So after a couple of years of trial and error, they found a policy that works, which is throwing a massive pile of no strings attached cash at families to help them have kids. I personally don't see many countries willing to follow that suit. I mean, there are simply limitations to financial support. Next slide, please. Basically, the proposition of a new, different population policy, which would address the population issues, would be to strive towards the people-centered policies and programs. There are a lot of propositions here. I mean, active labor market policies would be raise labor force participation. Much easier said than done, because we also need to talk about the quality of jobs being provided, quality of protecting the rights of workers as well. Migration management, I mean, migration should be managed, but also we should try to promote brain gain. I would say that there's a lot of effort invested in that direction right now, which is to, for instance, attract digital nomads, promote remote work arrangements. So in many ways, this is happening or has already happened. It's a high priority, I would say, to government right now. Social protection, this basically means to remedy small injustices that we encounter across the systems that lead to entire groups in our societies being devoid of some of the basic rights. In this case, it amounts to helping women return to labor force after childbirth. Also, regional local development, which comes down to looking at regional disparities, looking at human development index as one important indicator. I mean, for instance, in Serbia today, regional disparity is one of rising challenges that we are recognizing when you look at some parts like Belgrade and Novi Sad, where you have HDI that is comparable, for instance, to Poland, and other places across Serbia where HDI is more comparable to North Africa or Latin America. Digitalization, again, both working arrangements, but really it also comes down to services. For instance, part of our approach in helping this new immigration in a way is to move a lot of services online so that it will get people, and in a way that would be easier for foreigners who are thinking of perhaps immigrating to Serbia, help them see how it can be done. Next slide. And finally, which leads into immigration, that whatever we do in terms of tackling the population in the Western Balkans, immigration will have to be part of that equation or answer to this puzzle. And this will imply a whole set of measures and policies, updating legal framework, working on a unique work permit, resolving issues with registration of businesses, from really basic stuff like opening a bank account has been a problem, to more substantial like access to justice, and for asylum seekers respecting the principle non-refoulement. And finally, a concept or a program aimed at integration of immigrants, something where, other than access to education and healthcare, we haven't really made enough steps forward. A risk is emerging that something else might happen instead, which is basically because of the pressure coming from businesses, we will be importing labor, cheaper labor, from different destinations across the world in order to substitute for labor shortages. And there is an increasing risk that this will be done in a disorganized way at the expense of these workers' fundamental and all other rights. Now, to the question that basically I'm asking, and I would also like us to discuss more, is what is the future of a region that's rapidly shrinking and losing people? Because I think it's a valid question to ask. There are two potential scenarios. One starts from the premise of power transition theory, that population is key to understanding power in international relations, and that countries can there are basically two ways for countries to behave if you are an all power seeing potential rivals, you will engage them preemptively. If you are a young power, which is, again, trying to unseat the status quo, then you would also try to engage the more dominant power preemptively. And in this way, it speaks of conflict as inevitable. Either we are strengthening or weakening, it will result in conflict. Now, another scenario that I'm also, I would say, quite interested in is this scenario of decline, loss of human potential, inability to influence events, and finally becoming irrelevant. One strategy for smaller countries would be to actually become part of regional integration processes or become part of a wider process of integration like the European Union. We could argue that many countries across Europe have escaped such a scenario, becoming less relevant by becoming part of a alliance of countries that together present some relevance. For others who are in a limbo waiting for European integration process to continue, enlargement process to continue, one way to address would be to look at other ways of regional integration. But this is, again, the question. If not the EU, then what? What is this exact framework? And under whose rules it is going to take place? There are, for instance, many say competing. I would say that these are two processes that want the same thing, which is the common regional market under the auspices of the EU and the open Balkan. Basically, they all strive towards a common market, people, goods, and services, which is the same as the EU common market. And questions, I mean, some of the most important questions, of course, are related to rule of law. They are also the questions of jurisdiction, they are the questions of whose laws, and so on. And there is an underpinning reality, or potentially, that there will be net winners and losers of any regional integration process. This is something that we are, I think, are slowly realizing. And the idea should be somehow to minimize losses, but for the time being, not much what to do. Next slide. Some concluding remarks from my side. These frameworks for understanding and addressing depopulation are still predominantly national. Regional framework would need to be devised, but again, it depends on a number of these issues that they've asked. Our most valuable asset is still human potential, and it is our greatest contribution to the EU. I mean, there is this question of what do we bring to the EU. I mean, we have already brought something very significant to the EU, the human potential that we're living there today. We cannot predict how countries that restrict the human potential would behave in international relations. And I think that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is an interesting case. EU or member states of the EU are also part of the problem. I mean, they are the destination. Bilaterally, when we look at the problem bilaterally, some countries have been actively promoting immigration from the Western Balkans. But also, we need to look at circumambulation, understand it better, and see whether something could be done. I'm not an optimist here because these, for many people, these are survival strategies, and I can elaborate more. We should look closer at regional disparities and deconcentrate, decentralize, look at these mid-sized regional centers with their agglomerations and try to make them better places to live. And finally, whatever public policy we create, we need to think of for mainstream depopulation. Housing policy, taxation policy, all these policies influence decisions to raise a family. Thank you.
So, cosa c'è a noi?
Thank you, Mark. Really interesting. 2 points about, I don't know if it's clarification or just things that I'm curious about. One is linked to population. So is it a case of people aren't having babies and families now, or is it a case of people are leaving the region? Part of the reason why I asked that, because I've been in the Balkans since the 10th of July, and working with different young people, Montenegro and Albania and Serbia before, and Bosnia, and a lot of people that I spoke to said that the biggest challenge is the fact that people don't want to stay in their country and they're leaving. So that was just one thing. So just love some clarity on that one. And then the second thing, is it a case of, instead of shrinking population, thinking about who that population is? So if you think about, let's say, elites who take, let's say, have lots of the wealth, but they're like 1% of the population. So if we work with them, that would obviously have a beneficial impact in terms of but certainly development. If we work with a certain kind of population, let's say the elites, the wealthy elites, in comparison to thinking of all the population in general, I don't know. It's not my area. I'm just very curious.
Well, I mean, yeah, I can. I would actually try to answer the second question first. And here, working for the government, this is a live stream. There's, I think, one aspect of it that it's quite problematic, and I think you're right to raise that point, because really, labor shortages made us to start thinking seriously about it. So we are using as a team. I'm saying this very openly. We are using this whole pretext of labor shortage to try to persuade powers that be to look at the wider implications, to look at how, it's not only, we're not losing labor, we're losing people. We are losing human capital, and once some places, now that, my field of work is becoming very narrow, you see how a municipality is really fighting to save that high school. But then that high school is the last thing that prevents it from becoming, in a way, now we will have a reorganization of education, primary education, rationalization, basically, because there are not enough kids, so we'll see classes being combined. And that will lead to many, if there are people who have lived in a remote rural area, that's probably like, the final name of the coffin, and they decide to leave. It's some of the, it is unsettling, but, for us, it is a way to show the wider trend and to get them thinking, because it really comes down to quality of life. Politicians are obsessed with numbers, and, when we talk to, or when we try to talk to some of the ministers, we say numbers are not the only thing important. But they say numbers are also important, because it's, of course, a way of selling your policies. So we are fighting, I think, with that kind of approach. And I think that we really need to look, I can say this for certainty for Serbia, we need to look at labor rights. We need to, because this is part of the whole equation. It's easy to talk about remote work and work-life balance, if you are in the right profession. If you're not, you're expected to spend 8, 9 hours, 10 hours in a certain position, working on a machine. It's a different game. And then this will take a lot of realization, and we also have to be very realistic, because it's the whole thing with, for instance, we look at these on maternity leave. There are maybe 5 or 6 different groups in our society, women, that don't really have access to full rights, for different reasons. I don't want to go into this. But we are looking at one, because we need to start with this one, which are women entrepreneurs. Why? Because their voice is heard in our society, they're well organized, and if we get them over that threshold, then we'll get the others. But it's going to be hard. And the first question is absolutely. This is the problem, but I don't see changing how people think or see their future. It's really not. Fact is that young people don't really see their future in many of them. That doesn't mean that they will emigrate, but it is again a very personal decision, depends on many factors. If we could at least get them somehow, to try to get into this circle of migration, we are fighting for people in a way we would be happy. They could stay at least a couple of months and do something in their countries, come from. They can spend another, because I think that this is something that modern technology, modern travel actually enables you to do. You could spend 6 months somewhere, 6 months at home, working, contributing somehow. So, everything would be, I think, a step forward in that sense. But you're absolutely right.
Marco, thank you for this very inspiring lecture. The same problem is actually not only in the Western Balkans. It is a problem for the full Europe. The people from Germany live in Germany as well, mostly to Switzerland, but not only. But somehow the pool for Germany is in the Balkan or in the Eastern Europe. My question is actually whether we will have pool of new people for our region. That's the first question. The second question is actually close connected to the first. Do we develop already some instrument to make integration easy for this new citizen of our countries? Because if the people coming from Ukraine, that's probably easy. And it's probably the reason that the government from Poland or some other countries somehow trying to attract people from Ukraine. But if our new neighbors are people from some Asian countries, and that's something totally new for us, do we have already some integration concept, policies? Maybe Belgrade have something, or maybe you are doing on something. Or maybe you know that some other country in the region doing something. Thank you.
When it comes to integration, I'd say that we are at the beginning. We were always a transit country. We were never a country of destination. And this will demand first the whole asylum application, will demand a whole overhaul of the whole system. But also this very idea, these people are here to stay, is something that will have to be both communicated from the highest political levels, but really supported by all line ministries and different bodies in question. It will have to be a deliberate government effort. I can see that of all the policies that we will be recommending as a team, this is the one policy that will be most heavily criticized, which is slowly opening the door for immigration. What is happening now is import of labor, and it's happening in similar as in Croatia, I would presume. It's happening in the thousands already. There are some, professions where young citizens of Serbia are not interested anymore to work for different reasons. So I really see that as the future. Whether we can all expect to use, this is of course an awful term, but to use this tremendous pool that Ukraine presents, I really believe that other countries are better positioned. People will live there. And that also, to answer the first question that I think that our pool will be drained by 2030s. I mean 2030s at best. Of course, at best for those who are draining. I have to tell you that some of the policies that were done bilaterally, some of these policies are by now in Serbia. We have tried to put a stop to these policies. because we see that simply the way how the speed with which we have lost people in some professions was actually, whether it was surprising or alarming, I'm not certain, but it really happened quickly. And also, we need to think of that because of Corona and because of the pandemic, overall quality of life, average life expectancy for men in Serbia is now 3 years down from what it was in 2019 because of the pandemic. We lost 72,000 people in 2021 alone, so we had some 60,000 births and 152,000 deaths. The highest number since World War II. So, these numbers alone should be worrying. For me personally, my background is international relations. This is the problem. But unfortunately, a lot of these interventions are mid to long term. And I guess that when politicians look at what should be done, like improving quality of education, or some, just to mention one, many are simply, they look at the task ahead and it's easier to just put money and subsidize these pronatal policies to say that we want more kids. So this is, I really think we should really take a deep look at. You're working at the university, and we all know that number of kids enrolling is constantly going up.
Thank you, Marco, on very inspiring speech and great discussion about the challenge of rapidly shrinking population to the development of peace in countries of the Western Balkans. Thank you, Marco. And now we have another very interesting speaker. Ivan Maric is a young Croatian diplomat. He's young, but collected already an amazing diplomatic experience on different diplomatic posts, from European Parliament to German Bundestag, Indian Embassy in Croatia, German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and today he's working in the cabinet of the Minister of the Republic of Croatia, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs. He is very active and very social engaged in different NGO sector, and today he will talk about the role of power sharing to foster peace and ensure stability in times of uncertainty.
Thank you, Professor Bandov. Good day to all. As I said, I'm very pleased to be here with you. Very inspiring speeches and lectures until now. And many of these lectures, like demography, as we've heard right now, will also play a role in my short introduction to the topic of power sharing in times of uncertainty. First of all, I want to say what topics I will cover. First, I will talk briefly about power sharing and try to introduce the concept of anti-fragility to the power sharing agreements and consolidation of democracy and the importance of it. I will illustrate this with two case studies and two examples. First of all is the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. The second one is the Dayton Paris Peace Accords in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Third, I would leave my conclusions that in times, I will be now very, very frank, my conclusion is that in times of uncertainty, which come as challenges from inside and outside, it's better to stick with these power sharing agreements than try to reform it. And second, I will also touch upon the umbrella topic of this conference here in Dubrovnik about the role of academia in this. So I will be brief because I would like also to hear more from you as practitioners in peace studies and scientists. First of all, about power sharing. Power sharing is a practice in conflict resolution and fosters a compromise between different groups and adverse actors by sharing political, military, and economic power, especially in scarce situations. The famous political scientist Arnold Liebhardt sees the consociational democracy as one possibility of using in power sharing agreements. And that especially for societies emerging from conflict or societies with potential conflict. These are, for example, multi-ethnic states like Lebanon, or also Switzerland and Belgium, or countries which emerge from conflicts like Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example. I would like just briefly to mention what I consider is very vital for stability and peace building in such complicated societies. One of the main concepts is that all parties feel both as winners and losers. So it's not good that one party feels like the winner out of this, and the others as losers, and vice versa. That's why talking this in 2022, when we really see big changes in international relations and the international order, it is also important that these agreements and arrangements like consociational democracies are adaptable to the current situation, both from inside these countries, but also from external influence. That's why I would just briefly mention the concept of anti-fragility. It sounds very complicated at first, but it's a very simple term, more or less developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, an interesting person and intellectual. Just to explain about this, for example, you have a glass. And it can be both time fragile and stable. Fragile it is, if you hit it, it's gone. Stable is you hit it, it's there. But the concept of anti-fragility is something different. It's something when you hit the glass, it gets stronger. So it's flexible. A great example is a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, something doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. In fact, that's anti-fragility. And a good power sharing agreement, of course, then including consociational democracy, is the one when you hit it from inside or outside, it gets more stable. Or it gets stronger, not stable in the term of stability. Now I would like to take the two case studies to illustrate that. First, of Northern Ireland, a long conflict that lasted more than 3 decades. The so-called Troubles, ended in 1998 by the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, co-sponsored by, now they're coming co-sponsored from outside, by the United States, the UK, and the Republic of Ireland. And later the EU stepped in, which we also saw a major role playing in the later developments. But also from the inside were the two communities, the Catholics and the Protestants, saw that as the majority of them saw that as an opportunity to foster stability, peace, and all that. It worked pretty well with every doubt. There is no perfect power sharing. It's also worth to remember. But now I'm coming to the second part of my argument is uncertainty. The uncertainty and challenges to the power sharing agreements come first internal. Demographic changes play a role because we see a demographic shifting in Northern Ireland in favor of Catholic part of the Northern Irish population, which triggers uncertainty among the Protestant part of the society. And of course, external, which was much more influential in that, was Brexit. Because Brexit changed everything regarding the Good Friday Agreement, and you probably followed the debate following that about avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which was very tense, and you have also to consider which was very much in favor of the EU during the Brexit negotiations, among others, because the Republic of Ireland is also a member of the EU. So you had both internal and external challenges. Second example, Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Dayton Paris Accords stopped a bloody war, the bloodiest in post-war Europe, and it created a very complicated, complex state, which functions, in fact, until now, from 1995 till now. Also, you had external guarantors, like the United States, primarily the United States, but also other powers, like the EU, France, Russia, and Germany. But also, Croatia and Serbia were also co-signers of the Dayton Peace Accords. Of course, as with the Northern Irish case, uncertainty came up. First, the internal one. For example, the war roles of the three communities, because Bosnia is even more complicated than Northern Ireland, because in fact of two opposing adversaries, you have three. It was a very complicated power sharing agreement, but with a lot of success, especially after the period of after the war. But the internal ambitions of the group, also due to demographic changes, changed, and external one too, because of the lack of Western commitment, and now also with the consequence of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. So it's also a power sharing agreement that is now challenged from inside and outside, especially during also from malign influences, not only from Russia but from other external powers. So with these brief examples, I would put the following thesis. In times of uncertainties, challenges from inside and outside are often their goal is to overcome the status quo. In fact, overcoming what is there, that can take different forms. That can be political, legitimate political aims, and so on, but it can also be by violence, can also be by lobbying outside, can also be the changing international world order, and so on, where the sponsors don't want to support the arrangement anymore. But in the vast majority of cases, it's always the best to keep the power sharing as such as it is, with certain, as I said, with anti-fragility, with certain adaptations to it to keep it stable and maybe to adapt to changing demographics, for example, or economic outcomes and so on. The second, because the alternative is to try something new, which was not tested, and that may be in peace times where you don't have strong internal and external challengers is maybe good, maybe more pragmatic. But in times, for example, now when you have Brexit, you want to maybe to create a Northern Ireland where you insist on Northern Irish identity and one man, one vote. If you have a really changing moment in Northern Ireland's history, like Brexit, going from the EU. Similar also with Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my argument is, in times of crisis as such, it's better to stick with it and to adapt it, but not to overcome it in a completely way. You can also say that, for example, Lebanon is a negative example of it. But Lebanon, exactly because Lebanon is not stable as a country, it has a complicated power sharing agreement which kept the country together for a long period of time. But exactly what the case of Lebanon shows, because they haven't adapted to new times and new constellations, because the last census in Lebanon was made in 1931. And so it's important to also keep up this power sharing agreement. It's not set in stone, but it's also nothing that just to start anew. I will also say that is, in addition to that, I would also argue the academic influence on this. As I quoted Mr. Liebhardt, there are also other experts in academia, political science, and in other fields of study on power sharing agreements. As a practitioner and as a diplomat, I often see that academics try to put themselves on one side of of the parties inside a power sharing country. And that maybe through idealism, which is also very nice and very important, sometimes the pragmatic approach is lacking. Where, for example, in times of crisis, it is argued that a new arrangement is needed and not the one that we have right now. And often it becomes that academics become lobbyists, in fact, instead of scientists. So but it's of course in certain parts. Normally, scientists are keeping to academia and help to reduce the complexity of complex topics for practitioners, politicians, and others. So I would like to leave with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
So, next. Thank you for this presentation. I would like to draw your attention to, of course, yes, a lot about this, something about, which is the case of Kosovo. It was meant to be, by the end of this long process that started over a decade ago, it was meant to end in, I would say, a light, scaled down version of a power share. Light scaled down because the actual mandate of this association of civil majority municipalities, I would say, was a bit more symbolic than is the case. For instance, it wasn't symbolic than they understand. They just have to go to other. And I can say that, the EU's approach was incremental progress. Let's look at these everyday issues. Start small, build trust. Very, very reasonable, understandable program. But then, it seemed to me as if, not only for impatience, the passage of time, and actually how the whole debate evolved, and the whole context was very prone to external shocks and impatience. But I would also say predominantly there was a lack of trust. I mean, with passage of time, things have become more and more difficult. And now we are so far from an agreement that it seems to me that it is almost as if all agency has been given out to the external forces. That either will show up at some time, like ex machina, will solve this issue in a matter of, we will bring them. It was, I think, even Federica Mogherini said at one point, I will, bring them to a room, throw away the key until they finally reach. I mean, I see something similar with, Schmidt's idea of giving them a couple of weeks to solve all the issue. And also, another thing why I'm drawing your attention is to said that really academics have, I wouldn't say, they haven't lost credibility, I can go that far, that is much to say. But they do take sides. And it has also been I would say that for me, it has become a matter of personal frustration, because I was very devoted to together with my colleagues from Kosovo, working on finding ways to address this issue. But also because you see yourself being drawn in, you get labeled very quickly. Very quickly. If you show understanding with discourse regard policy, or if you try to give space for voices. And it is also, it has turned to be, it is a process that's actually demanding more transparency. There is a demand for more transparency. You can see how this transparency is also making matters more complex. I guess what I'm saying is that power sharing must be the end result. But we have come to a point where the very mentioning of power sharing would drive population away, or politicians. Simply to become very hard for them to sell this idea of vision.
Thank you very much, especially about mentioning Kosovo and Serbia. The thing is that this was never perceived as a power-sharing agreement, because I was talking about consociational democracies, which is one state, one or a complicated society inside. And as many countries in the world did, Kosovo is an independent state. And as such, different rules apply to it. It's not in a power sharing in a way. It's complicated, but it's also a bilateral thing, because you have two sides which needs to reach an agreement. Of course, we can talk about the external influence and the success of the European Union, but I would say that the rules of a power sharing, which is established by an agreement, was never achieved in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue as such. I think it's a success that even a dialogue exists, because we saw also yesterday that it's not set in stone, it's not stable, but I would argue that exactly because we did not achieve an agreement like we have in other cases is part of the problem, not because that hard and external and internal challenges were too strong. So I would just leave it that. But about the role of academia, I think science and academia in international relations is of utmost importance. I think we see it now in this crisis in Eastern Europe and with the aggression against Ukraine, that good academicians and experts in international relations are quite in demand. Because people, especially in the beginning of the invasion, people were searching for answers. I think many academicians took a great lead to that and calmed people down, for example, because many were afraid that it will escalate, God forbid, into nuclear war or whatever, and then they calmed down the public with their expertise and explained many things. And I think it's a great example how science and how people who are in, especially international relations, can have a great influence on the public in a very positive and calming way. Because myself as a diplomat, our job is to foster dialogue, to try to understand each other and to reach to a compromise or at least an understanding. And I think experts in international relations and academia as such can be the bridge between policymakers, the public, but also between different countries and different arrangements inside societies and between countries.
When we are talking about power sharing, and when we are talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and when we are talking about Kosovo, I have a question actually about the Balkan region. When we are talking about influence of foreign actors, can you explain to me why Europe didn't react on the time to prevent influence of some foreign actors in the Balkan region? Because this, for example, this happened yesterday in Serbia, actually in Kosovo. It's not easy to understand as only Kosovo-Serbia conflict. It is more or less actually conflict between Russia and Western societies. Someone pushed it. And we know this kind of escalation can happen in Kosovo, but this can happen in Bosnia as well. And probably it can happen in Macedonia as well. Somehow we are lucky that in Montenegro, they try, but without success in the moment. But how is it possible that the Western societies overlooked that? Didn't solve that, didn't recognize in the time that, because that is actually the part of our garden, inner garden of Europe. It's different situation if we are talking about some Central Asian country, and it's different if we are talking about Europe. Can you try to explain that? Are we too focused on us, on European things like the Brexit, like Euro crisis, like that, or something else?
I would take the example of Jacques Delors in the 90s when the war in former Yugoslavia broke out. He said that the hour of Europe is there, but in the end we saw that the hour of Europe didn't materialize like it was intended to, and other powers, as you said, took lead. But I would differentiate between influence of the EU and other actors. From each country to each country, situation is different. As we have the Dayton peace accords, of course, it was fostered by the United States in support by the US. But I would say in the mentioned dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, the EU was the one in the lead. So I think we should distinguish between certain countries and not take it as because we have different situations. Some of these countries are part of NATO, some are not. So in Montenegro, as you rightfully mentioned, there are challenges, but they still manage to become part of NATO, and in that regard also part of the Western alliance, at least in the security and military sense. So, in fact, the three countries which are not part of NATO and which are not part of the EU is Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo. As such, and these countries are the crucial one where you rightfully said the West needs to step up, but also it's not only about the West. We also hear it from this region a lot of times. The West should be more active. These countries also didn't deliver. It's, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina got from the European Commission as part of the EU enlargement process 14 points to fulfill to get ahead in the EU enlargement process. Just one was achieved. So the EU in this case was very much transparent. What do you need to do that? And you didn't do your homework because of different reasons. Or, for example, at the moment, the electoral law in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The West, the US, including the EU, gave a chance to the actors to foster a compromise. And the parties did not deliver, mostly because of the internal challenges of the power sharing agreement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where one party wants to change unilaterally the agreement as such. But I think it's a both-way street. It's not only about the West doing, and I think other powers like Russia and China just use this misunderstanding between the two parties.
Any interaction?
I was thinking of whether to try and answer it because it's a discussion that we want to have over the last quite period. But I would also be careful not to, look for the wrong kind of Russia in everything that's taking place in our region. There are also reasons, other underlying reasons. Being long-term, short-term, Russia is using this space as it allowed into this space. Perhaps Western's complacency or activity is something to it, but I think really at times we do our own bidding. We don't necessarily need Russia. I have to tell you that when it comes to the whole, the situation, for instance, my country, Serbia, finds that right now is the perfect storm because we allowed ourselves to be exposed in international. We hope that the situation, the context,
meaningful a long time, and then you bring more really got everything good. So sometimes I'm just, kind of a word of caution. Read Russia. The same goes for other countries that have their own interests. They have their own interests. Influence at times can be pushed a political line. At times, some of it can be even constructive. Turkey is an example. As
I would just add to that, as we are in Croatia, I would add also the Croatian perspective to it, because Croatia, as a new country, which is the one bordering this region, with the longest EU external border, especially with Bosnia and Serbia, we have an obligation to put this topic, as Professor Bandov said, high on the agenda, and the continuous work of the Croatian government also showed that this topic is not dead, because in many EU Council meetings and others, you saw that the topic is high on the agenda, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was not the main topic for a long period of time, is now also one of the major topics in Brussels. So that also shows the transformative effect of being part of the EU, because Croatia has the most stakes to have a stable, prosperous, and developed neighborhood. And with Croatia accessing the EU, this topic is of importance for Croatia, but also for other countries which are nearby this region. So I would just add that it's that also a country that went through conflicts like in the neighboring countries, and which experienced a transformative process that is serving as an example. And we still see that the European idea has its potentials with Albania and North Macedonia starting finally the EU accession process, and the political goal which these countries wanted achieved is very important, and it shows that this idea, if also Europe and both sides step up, as I said, has the potential to also experience this transformative element, because the largest trading partner and cultural partner in many other ways is the European Union, and I think this will, in these times of uncertainty, just becomes evident and strong.
Dear friends, so thank you, Ivan, for inspiring speech and discussion. Thank you for discussing actually a very important topic in the Balkan, about power sharing, about dialogue. We really need that immediately. And thank you for your short analysis of the situation in the Balkan region. Thank you. And we are coming today to our last speaker today. We are very happy to welcome to our conference as a speaker Tomislav Meštrović, a medical doctor with a PhD degree from the University of Zagreb. Tomislav is an associate professor at the University of North in Croatia and a visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And he worked this year in the Department of Health Metrics Science at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Tomislav holds several fellowships, College of American Pathologists, Fellow of the Royal Society for Public Health, and Fellow of the European Committee for Sexual Medicine. He is a member of Global Young Academy since 2022, this year. For me, somehow most important, his clinical work resulted in 3 patient choices best doctor awards. So 3 in a row, one guy, I don't know what's happened, but congratulations. Thomas will speak today on the mortality and disability due to conflict and terrorism in European sub-region and worldwide, insights from the global burdens of disease from 2019 study. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot first to Professor Bandov for inviting and to the whole organizing committee for inviting me. It's been a privilege to participate in these discussions. And I hope to participate in the future again. And despite these Doctor of the Year awards, I basically mostly abandoned my clinical work in lieu of my public health and global health work. So I'll present a bit of results and a bit of what I did during my fellowship at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And we were talking a lot about on the role of academia in preserving peace, also one of the important roles of academia. We also quantify the burden of war related to deaths and injuries, and this is something that has been done systematically, and I'll try to show some of the results of it. So on the next slide, first we have to state that armed conflicts as such were not a big part of the public health research so far, and did not receive the same attention as some other causes of disease and death. And mostly political sciences and social sciences dealt with armed conflicts, but mostly in terms of the decisions that cause war, not human deaths, not disabilities. And this is important to address because there are both direct effects of combat, in effect of direct casualties, but also indirect consequences, which means displaced populations, spread of many infectious diseases, destroyed habitats. So this is something that has to be taken into account when discussing such issues. And on the next slide, there is then two ways to approach this. We need direct estimation of conflict on mortality, and formally this is the number of deaths that follows, the number of casualties that follows war on the battlefield. But also indirect estimation of conflict and mortality has to be assessed. And for example, this can be defined as the number of deaths following a war minus the number of deaths that would have occurred in the same period if war had not occurred. So in a way, we have a counterfactual scenario here. And for most wars, these indirect effects will show a loss, which means if there wasn't a war, more people would stay alive, so there was a loss, a tragic loss of human lives. In some instances, that could be even a gain. For example, if war resulted in the destruction of a regime that maybe would kill even more people if war would happen. But in most instances, these indirect estimations show us. We shouldn't neglect the effects on health status, especially on human behavior and susceptibility to the disease. We have also heard a lot of psychological perspectives, and of course, we have to take into account the psychological trauma that comes with social displacement and migration, but also everything that happens in the environment, the destroyed infrastructure, destroyed biosphere, of course, destruction of public health programs, which are sometimes very important to preserve the health of certain nation. So on the next slide, this is everything that was said. It's important to measure direct and indirect impact. That has many direct implications for peace. So why is that? Because in business, Peter Drucker introduced the term, what gets measured gets managed, in a way that can be maybe broadened. And in this sense, we may be saying what gets quantified can be tackled by evidence-based policies, and we can undertake risk assessment. And this risk assessment can also result in forecasts of the risks of conflict. And these forecasts can be updated based on the events as they occur, which is increasingly important today as well. And the fundamental challenge in quantifying the health impacts of conflict is during the war, health systems and health information systems often cease to function. Populations affected by conflict, we have an example from Croatian War of Independence, where Croatia and Bosnia were reporting regularly to the World Health Organization all the data, but after 1991, they stopped until the war finished, and then you have a gap in data availability, and this is then a huge problem in quantifying the health impacts. So often these health impacts are quantified retrospectively, but then again can inform at least future actions. So on the next slide, it's important to highlight how we can measure the mortality, how that's on conflict can be measured. And when you don't have functioning civil registration systems, then conflict-related deaths, maybe you can detect them through demographic analysis of census data. And before and after conflict, you compare these two periods, or maybe through indirect mortality measurements. For example, you prepare survey questions or survival of siblings or parents during the war. And a lot of published analysis of deaths from conflict rely on press reports, sometimes eyewitness accounts, which can be a problem. We know sometimes there can be a bias in this type of data, and also depends on the information that is provided. And also a sheer problem in analyzing a huge amount of data that's published in the press. Maybe we will rely in the future more on machine learning and some other algorithm that do this analysis. But this is something that can be problematic. But when you take a lot of data into account, on the next slide we can see that one of the most important tools to quantify health loss today is the global burden of disease study, which analyzes the loss from hundreds of diseases, injuries, and risk factors. Basically, it represents a consortium of more than 7,000 researchers in more than 156 countries worldwide. The number of researchers grew, especially during COVID-19, because the global burden of disease is produced by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is a part of the University of Washington, and they were responsible for COVID-19 forecasts, which really then piqued the interest of the public. So also increased the number of researchers that participate in many different data analysis endeavors, and all of these researchers not only analyze data, but also contribute data and compare the data in their comments. So today, the study assesses more than 350 diseases or injuries in 195 countries from 1990 to present day, so which means we can compare different time periods, different locations, and different demographic factors. And this produced over 1 billion data points, which increases with every iteration of the study. So on the next slide, we'll see that these estimates are most often expressed as specific metrics because this is granularity to the data. And besides that, some of the metrics that are used by GBD or global burden of disease are years of life lost due to premature mortality. And here we take into account the expected life, the life expectancy in a certain country. And if a person dies 10 years earlier, then this is 10 years of life lost on top of the death that happened. And also we have a metric, years lived with disability, which are years lived in less than ideal health. This depends on the disability rates. For example, if you have a conflict that results in paraplegia in a certain individual, consensus is the disability rate for this condition is 0.5, which means 20 years of his life after this incident is worth like 10 years. So he is like 10 years short of life. This is also one important metric. And when you combine these two metrics, years of life lost and years lived with disability, you're going to measure disability adjusted life year, which is also then something that is used in these comparisons, which means 1 year lived with disability. So on the next slide, I hope we're going. Okay, so GBD cause list is something how we group all these diseases in the global burden of disease study. And level 1 is the most broadest one. Here we group communicable diseases, chronic or non-communicable diseases, and injuries. When we talk about conflict and terrorism, we have 3 levels here. So umbrella level is injury, level 2 is interpersonal violence, and level 3 is conflict and terrorism. So some causes have level 4, which would be, for example, if we divide conflict and terrorism into 2 categories. But for now, it is decided that it's only level 3, and we don't need for this category and for the analysis purposes level 4. And before we go to the specific results, maybe just important definitions that were put forth in GBD 2019 how the study defines the war. It defines it as a state of armed conflict between states, governments, societies, and paramilitary groups, characterized by extreme violence, aggression, destruction, and mortality, and also the use of regular or irregular military forces. And terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of threat or threatened use of force or violence against individuals or property to intimidate or coerce governments or societies. When you compare countries and casualties in the war, not only these factors and metrics that we stated are taken into account, but also social demographic index as a summary measure to see where the country lies on the spectrum of development. And it's composed of income per capita, average years of schooling, and total fertility rate. So, a country that has a low social demographic index will have a low income per capita, will have a lower number of average years of schooling, and higher total fertility rate. So how can you classify countries in accordance with their development? And on the next slide, the data for conflict and terrorism that went into the analysis mostly came from Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and also from Armed Conflict Data Set from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We also use Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Set, and also Global Terrorism Database from the University of Maryland, as well as data from Amnesty International. 4 major conflicts were not represented in these databases, most notably the 1997 civil conflict in Albania, 2 genocides in Burundi, 1 genocide in Bangladesh. For these conflicts, literature reviews were used. This is how the data was informed in this case. So on the next slide, I will start with some of the results. And in 2019, conflict and terrorism was responsible for 63,000 estimated deaths. Of these deaths, 47,500 occurred in locations with low social demographic index. Only 34 occurred in locations with high social demographic index. So the remaining number of deaths occurred in the remaining middle social demographic index, so to say. Even more importantly, conflict and terrorism was also responsible for more than 6 million disability-adjusted life years globally. So it's a huge burden on remnants of those injuries, not only injuries, but also other psychological factors that are outcome of conflict in certain countries or areas. Maybe this is better depicted on the next slide, where you see a global snapshot, a global map of this distribution of these disability-adjusted life years. You can see for 2019, highest burden is in Africa, not only Sub-Saharan, but all Africa. Also some parts of South America. But you can see here the Balkans is highlighted. You can see the high burden of Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, still stemming from the Croatian War of Independence. So still a lot of disability-adjusted life years here in this region of the Balkans. On the next slide, you can see the comparisons of male and female gender in regards to these disability-adjusted life years, and you can see in the Middle Ages, male gender dominates. But when you look at the kid ages, you see that there is no difference in regards to male and female, which is no wonder. Maybe one promising bit of information is that rankings of deaths due to conflict and terrorism really dropped from 58th place in 1990s to 88th place in 2019. Of course, when we will have GBD 2022 and all the data from Ukraine war will go into the analysis and models, this will probably change, but for now, let's see the improvement when we take all the data up to 2019. So on the next slide, I ask a question, what is the situation in Europe? This is the study I was included in while at the University of Washington, so we assessed the burden of injury in Central, Eastern, and Western European sub-region. Of course, when I was grouping the causes of diseases, we said that part of these large groupings of the injury is also conflict and terrorism. But on the next slide, we first see that these number of injuries really dropped between 2000 and 2019 in Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. The highest drop was in Western Europe by 45%, but also the highest drop was in Eastern Europe by 45%, but also there was a drop in Central and Western Europe by 27%, respectively. And when we concentrate on the next slide on disability adjusted life-year rates for conflict and terrorism specifically, we can again see the largest drop in this period in Eastern Europe, but also there was a drop in Central and Western Europe. Bear in mind, the drop in Western Europe and also other parts may seem large, but even the baseline rate was low. So this drop in Western Europe can also be seen as not such a high drop because from the beginning we have low numbers. This is a quote from the study. Despite a large decline in daily rates resulting from conflict and terrorism, we observed that over this 20-year study period, the burden of terrorism remained at its peak in Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. Again, these countries that were highlighted on the map, and these are all remnants from the more independence. And study further says many Balkan inhabitants may therefore still be experiencing the long-term consequences of injury. We'll see how these numbers will change during the years. And when you compare Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, some surrounding countries, so Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia have disability-adjusted life-year rates in thousands. Hungary only has 5 disability-adjusted life years. Slovakia only 3. So these are huge and stark differences. On the next slide, before I end, I'll just show you what some of the tools from these Institute of Health Metrics can do. You can always visualize these numbers, even health disparities between some countries that were and still are in war. For example, I try now to, for example, compare child mortality between Israel and Palestine and how it compared through the years. And although the gap between these two countries in child mortality diminished over time, in Palestine it's still nearly 5 times larger than it is in Israel. So there is still much to do, and we can ascribe a lot of this effect to war. And on the next slide, we also see maternal mortality. Levels in Palestine are more than double than levels in Israel. When you look at maternal deaths per 100,000 live births in these two countries. Maybe the most striking visualization is on the next slide, where you compare a complete burden of disease practically between these two countries in disability-adjusted life years. And bear in mind, these are age standardized rates. So you take into account the difference in age stratification of a certain country. Also some other socio-demographic factors, and you can see in Palestine it's a lot larger burden of cardio and circulatory diseases than in Israel, a higher burden of mental and behavioral disorders, and also a higher burden of diabetes. You can do these comparisons by yourself using these tools, and you can really see and get some striking results when comparing these countries that are in war. So what I wanted to highlight in the next slide, maybe coming back to the definition of what is health from the World Health Organization. It's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not only absence of disease or infirmary. And when you have conflict and post-conflict situations, the emphasis is on survival, but there are still remnants of not so perfect health anymore after the war. And the entire generations can be affected, and there is also problem of migration, protracted insecurity. So the ultimate ambition of the whole medicine, but also of these health metric sciences, should not be just following deaths, but also following healthy years of healthy life. And on the next slide, maybe just to conclude, that we have to continue to document and to record the effects of conflict on health if we want to support fair and equitable resource prioritization. And also, this is something to inform further actions. So first, we have to measure something to see what kind of effect it had on human health if we want to inform public health measures, and if you want to focus and be prepared on something like it's going to happen again, in order to minimize and mitigate the health impacts and to prepare preventative interventions. So this is also something when you do comparisons how to address the vital determinants of health. And I believe this global burden of disease study and the approach and the metrics it uses can be a way of how to pursue an evidence-informed look into the past and for the future. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Any questions?
I just wanted to ask because the data you were showing, for instance, I was thinking about this very Palestinian case, I know pretty well. In terms of mental health, for instance, in Palestine, it's something that is still something very stigmatizing, which means that the level of occurrence of this kind of diseases might not be very realistic, because again, so what happens when, I don't know, when you get shot, you go to the hospital, and then it's quite easy to report. Is my question in terms of mental health, how reliable are these data? Do you have some kind of correction factor? So that in some countries where, well, actually everywhere, but in some countries more than others, can this data get a little bit more realistic? This is on one side. And my other question is, visibility is also a way of, is a tool of war, let's put it this way. The way that brave and their means of war, sometimes it is not so important to kill the people. It's actually better or more important just in terms of deterrence and in terms of maiming the enemy, just to make them more dependent and visibility. So this can also be have you seen an evolution in the rates of visibility in certain conflicts? It is something that is stable, or it is still a means of war in certain conflicts?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very important questions. I'll first refer to your first question about the data. So, of course, there are problems from country to country in regards to not only data quality, but also some countries are really data sparse. And this is accounted in the models. So models use a lot of covariance and a lot of tools on how to nivellate these differences. So we sometimes have in these model situations where you have a really just a small number of data sources from one country. Then you maybe inform your models from the situations in the neighboring countries. It's not perfect. Maybe sometimes this is the best approach you have. And it's always a work in progress. So data is repeatedly sought. And sometimes these data sources are improved. But this is the problem. It's always an issue that we take into account in these modeling approaches. Is sometimes a lot of conditions are underreported, especially mental health ones. This is something that is accounted in the models when you compare differences between different countries. And as we have disability weights for disability adjusted life years, you also have weights when you compare the data, and you also have ways how to assess data quality in different countries. Again, just to create as good models as we possibly can. The whole global burden of disease endeavor is always an ongoing, imperfect working process. And every iteration is a bit better. Hopefully, the next one will show you a more precise representation. In regards to your second question, yeah, this is exactly what is happening during the war, and this is exactly why these injury studies are taking into account more disability-adjusted life years than only that. A lot of statistics is represented that way. Another interesting thing is in GPT 2019 iteration, level 2 became interpersonal violence just because of these things that you say. Before that, in previous iterations, it was a different classification. But now, conflict and terrorism is not only reflected in that, but even more in this, what she just said, and that's why they part of the category interpersonal violence. Yeah.
Thank you. But really, congratulations. Really interesting and important research, and I particularly like the conclusion in terms of where you said living well instead of just living. And it's funny that in the last week, I thought I saw a tweet from Johan Galton, the father of peace studies, and he said something along the lines of what's happening with peace studies, just counting corpses. We need to remember why we started, the idea of peace studies, so it made me think of that. You laid out a definition for war and a few other things. Can you say the definition of conflict? I know you put terrorism terrorism there.
That's the same definition, war and conflict.
Okay.
Terrorism, yeah, they use it maybe interchangeably.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not completely right, but for the definition purposes, because it's quite broad, and I think it can be used to define both war and conflict. But this is also a problem. It was even a bigger problem before. Like I said, when you do a data acquisition, precise definitions are important in ways how will you classify something.
Yeah, it's because you said Uppsala, so if you follow Uppsala's armed conflict, that's the difference, right? They define armed conflict, war, 100,000 battlefield deaths. But you said there before conflict and terrorism, so does the conflict part mean really armed conflict and not just normal conflict?
Yeah, it's armed conflict.
Okay.
It's armed conflict.
Okay.
Do you have any more?
So if someone wants to ask the question, that's great, but we can continue, of course, discussing later. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I spoke yesterday or day before with Tomislav, and then we spoke. It is great that he's not only one doctor here, we have two doctors, and he said, it's amazing. I said, no, look, we need Are we on Zoom?
No.
No.
Oh, actually, we are on Zoom, but we don't have any other.
Okay, so now I want to say, we are actually very lucky to be interdisciplinary in this room, and I think that it's necessary to have interdisciplinary approach to understand something, and peace is so complex. If you don't have influence of different disciplines, of political science, anthropology, sociology, medicine, economy, law, and so on, you can't understand peace at all. So it is very complex. So I'm very lucky that we are in this interdisciplinary group, that we can hear, only shortly, sorry, when I studied my master program, in Hamburg, and then I faced first time in my life with theology. It was the Master of Peace. Theology, the physics on this high level, about nuclear energy. And then I thought, my God, I'm a lawyer. Why I have to learn about nuclear energy? Now, of course, I understood later, and we had so great discussion with evangelic priesters on, evangelic theory, and then the Buddhist priest. I was, okay, really I need it. But today I understand that we really need it. If you want to understand peace, it is very complex, and thank you to be with us. Thank you to give this approach to show us from your point of view that this is of course important for peace. Because we are not talking here about peace as the absence of violence, we are talking about peace as a peace of positive peace. So thank you once again, thank you. And Ivan, we can close.